I'm Kelly M., and this is The Common Surface, and we are blessed to have Dr. Joseph B. Farrell with us. Dr. Farrell has a degree in patristics from the University of Oxford and several other degrees as well, and he joins us on the Common Surface podcast to discuss his Giza pyramid thesis.
Howdy, everybody. Thanks for having me back, Kelly.
Yeah. So, so I've been thinking about, I've read the book, the Giza Death Star Revisited. I know there's a new book coming out. I've ordered it, but it hasn't arrived. And I've read the book, and I've been thinking a lot about the human scale things. If you imagine, one of the things that you've suggested is that you believe that the Great Pyramid may have, in fact, been the Tower of Babel. Right?
Yes.
So if that's the case, then they would suggest that there were human scale, analogs in the Great Pyramid, such as the length of a forearm, right? Or other particular, harmonic analogs of the scale of human beings, maybe the size of a skull, with respect to influencing the cranium, right, and the inner cavity. So, do you have any thoughts on that, or is that just beyond your focus?
No, it's not. It's not, so to speak. It's not part of the actual thesis, I argue, in that book. However, the thing that people have to understand is I write books so that they all kind of dovetail into each other. I wrote a book a few years back called The Grid of the Gods. And then I wrote another book almost at roughly the same time called Microcosm and Medium. And in both books, there is an ancient doctrine that I kind of highlight much more specifically in Microcosm and Medium. And that doctrine is the idea that mankind is a microcosm of the universe. And basically, I point out in that book that the microcosm doctrine is really nothing but the ancient way of arguing what modern cosmological physicists have been advancing or arguing with their anthropic cosmological principle. That principle, in a nutshell, as far as cosmological physics puts it, that principle in a nutshell is saying that the universe is indeed a product of intelligent design because it appears that the universe was created with the idea of intelligent observers of it in mind. This sounds very paradoxical, and in a certain sense it is. But basically, what this means is that mankind himself, to a certain extent, is kind of the philosophical or topological measure of the universe. That said, the other part of this thesis that I tried to advance and argue in Grid of the Gods, and again, I argued it in another book of mine called Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. And that is that ancient systems of measure, particularly when you look at them in connection with all of the megalithic structures that dot the surface of the planet, that these structures and the systems of measurement upon which they're based appear to be based on geodetic and astronomical systems of measure. And this is a very crucial point, because what it means is that the old saw that we were taught in elementary school or junior high school back in the days when they were trying to teach us anything in the schools in this country, the old saw that the ancient units of measure were based on body part measurements is just nonsense, because of course your forearm and my forearm are going to be of a different length. So you can't base any comprehensive or global system of measurement on something that's changeable like that. What they require, especially for commerce, is a system of measurements that are going to be more or less uniform across the planet. And that means that you have to have geodetic and astronomically based systems of measure, because those things are not going to change or be that variable over time. And this is exactly what the ancients did.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm arguing a rather complex case. That said, in reference to your Tower of Babel question, I wrote a little book called The Tower of Babel Moment of History. It's on Lulu. And that phrase, incidentally, is not mine. It's actually Leonard Bernstein's phrase, but I just love the phrase.
It's perfect.
It is. It's a wonderful phrase, particularly in the context in which he uses it. But
it may not have been wonderful for the people who experienced it, but for us, it's a
right.
handy catchphrase.
Right. So the Tower of Babel hypothesis, basically, I'm arguing that the Great Pyramid might be that structure, simply because if you look at the Old Testament version of the story, and there's lots of apocryphal versions out there as well, which again, I don't think they should be discounted. But just taking the Old Testament version of the story on its own, there's that statement in the 11th chapter of Genesis where the story occurs, that humanity was building this tower which could reach unto heaven. And if humanity were ever to complete it, they would be able to do whatsoever, and this is, I'm quoting now, whatsoever they imagined to do. Well, it's that part about the tower reaching unto heaven. This has conjured all sorts of ridiculous Renaissance paintings, by Bruegel and everybody trying to paint this enormous tower that, they're going to build to heaven. And, that's taking the reference in a kind of a clumsy, backhanded, and pardon my French here, but half-assed sort of way. I think the reference should be taken literally, but taken literally in the sense that the tower which reaches unto heaven incorporates dimensional analogs of the measures of local celestial space-time. That's what I think it means.
Like they messed up the planet, now they're going to gain the means to mess up the heavens.
Right, exactly. So I'm arguing that because the Great Pyramid incorporates so many, just right off the top of my head, oddball types of dimensional measures. People have been studying this thing and finding out all sorts of weirdness about it for decades and decades. And it was really Isaac Newton that set off all of this, because he had this notion that the Great Pyramid was kind of a representative or an analog or a miniature Earth, but he also went on to say that it was a miniature universe. So, he's toying along with the same idea. So I think you can argue the case that if there was a Tower of Babel that could reach unto heaven, the Great Pyramid is a almost perfect candidate in that respect for that structure.
Right. So the ancient phrase "as above, so below," if you consider it in the case of the Tower of Babel / pyramid case,
right?
You get a situation where, the key word is the word reach. What does the word reach mean, right? Reach could mean, something with respect to extent.
Right.
It could mean that instead of as above, so below, it becomes as below, so above.
Right. Or you reach the heavens by tapping into it.
Right.
And again, it's a literal way of reading it, but it's very different than those Renaissance paintings of these gigantic nonsensical towers. And something I pointed out in the Tower of Babel book was that the celebrated Renaissance Jesuit scholar, Father Athanasius Kircher, who's an interesting fellow. He's kind of the last great Renaissance man, because this guy just likes to write and speculate about everything. And I mean everything. But Kircher, being both a speculator and a Jesuit and a priest all at the same time, decided that he was going to solve the Tower of Babel problem here and calculate the actual number of bricks and how long it would take, according to the measurements of his day, for the tower to reach the moon, and how long it would take the horses to drag the bricks up. And he, of course, and I put all this in the Tower of Babel book because, he comes up with just astronomical amounts of bricks and comes to the conclusion that it would require more bricks than the entire planet was capable of producing. And, it would be so heavy that it would probably knock the planet off its orbit, and the horses would take too long, on and on he went. But, the point was made that if you're looking at the Tower of Babel that way, it's a nonsensical story, which was his whole point.
Wow.
But let's go back. He's looking at all these paintings that people are producing, and he's just thinking to himself, this is ridiculous. This is not what it means.
Yeah, the emperor has no clothes, Kircher style.
Right.
Yeah. So let's go back to this idea of the human beings, or the genus Homo, and maybe it isn't, the particular length of an arm bone we're talking about. Let's say it's the ratio of leg bone length to arm bone length to skull size. You know what I'm saying? Sort of the internal harmonics of genus Homo. And we think about the human being as a sensor for the universe, right? Detecting and observing, which is what we mean by observing. In physics, we mean it's an analogy to detection, right? So we have human beings detecting the universe, and we have this device that human beings are built that are going to amplify their thoughts into actions in the physical realm. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, yeah, I do. At one point in that book, and in the original 3 versions of the book, I do at one point talk about the Great Pyramid as an observer. In other words, it is a machine that is designed to incorporate dimensional analogs of various universal or harmonic structures within the universe, and therefore, as an observer or detector, it's also a manipulator of them. Because again, if we're following the modern quantum mechanical school of physics, observation is also an effect upon what is being observed.
Right. If you look at the modern quantum mechanics experiments, one of the things that you notice right away is, in order to get the apparatus to do what they want, they have to manipulate observation.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Which to our audience, literally means they have to create pairs of entangled protons, and they peak at one of them, but they don't peak at the other one.
Right.
Right. And so they're doing all these tricks to kind of like, to sort of like sidestep the effects of observation, at least temporarily. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's pretty much what's going on here. Now, with respect to the ratios of human body parts, I think, this is a fairly old doctrine. You can think of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, or you can go all the way back to Vitruvius himself and see similar types of thinking going on, the Pythagoreans, and on we could go. Certainly it's there also in the Vedic literature, this idea that human body parts are based on certain ratios in proportion to each other. And then, of course, once you say ratios or proportion, you're talking about harmonics.
Right.
So yeah, I think in that sense, yes, you can say that the pyramid is built as a as a kind of a microcosm of the microcosm, in this case of mankind. But more generally, I think that you have to look at the harmonic series itself, and certainly mankind incorporates aspects of the harmonic series. Mankind is kind of a subset of the harmonic series. But if you look at the harmonic series itself, I think it's very, very clear when you look at the dimensions of the Great Pyramid and you see these redundant measures or multiplications of those measures or divisors of those measures happening and occurring over and over and over in the structure. It becomes very clear that this thing is a harmonic oscillator. There's no other reason for it. This is my principal problem with the argument that the Great Pyramid is nothing but a great big stone hall of records of weights and measures.
Yeah.
The idea in itself is sound. What's not sound about it is once you have established a measurement, a certain standard for a particular measure of length or of volume or what have you. And all measures of volume are based ultimately on measures of length. So once you've established this, then it becomes kind of stupid to assume that you go on and on repeating that length in a structure. So in other words, it's the repetition in the structure to me that's arguing that these things are there for a functional purpose rather than simply a memorial or archival purpose.
Very interesting. Now, in your book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, or maybe it was Grid of the Gods. I don't remember. I think it was Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. You talked about the relationship of the I Ching to the structure of human DNA.
That was in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men.
Yeah. And so, has anybody ever done an analysis of the relationship of the I Ching to the Great Pyramid?
To the Great Pyramid? No,
Yeah.
not to my knowledge. There have been a couple of books, and to be honest with you, Kelly, right off the top of my head, I wasn't anticipating that question, so
okay.
I can't remember the title of the book. That there is a book out there that is all about DNA and the I Ching, and right off the top, I have a copy of it in my library somewhere.
Yeah.
I just can't remember what the title is. And I got interested in that book because another book I had been reading was all about Leibniz and the I Ching.
Oh, interesting.
And he was fascinated by it.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, yeah. What else would someone like Leibniz be fascinated in?
Now,
the I Ching.
The I Ching has Boolean logic embedded in it. And for those of us who don't know mathematics, Boolean logic is the mathematics of 0 and 1. So if you design an entire mathematical system where you only had two numbers, 0 and 1, what would it look like?
Right.
It would have lots of zeros and ones in various combinations that could be converted to, our modern number system, or it could be converted to any number of different things. But think about it, mathematics, if you only had 0 and 1. And so is there anything Boolean about the pyramid?
Well, that is a very interesting question. Right off the top of my head, I'm going to crawl way out on a limb and say yes, but in a very roundabout way, in that I think the pyramid is designed, or was designed, let's put it that way, by the use of a kind of system of topological analysis that I'm going to call analogical calculus. And you know what I'm talking about. I
do, yeah.
But in when you get into the formal explicitness of what such a calculus might look like, No one has completed one. Leibniz made some significant steps in that direction. I think the mathematical language of topology comes the closest to being able to get there, because I think it is possible to formally specify analogical functions with topological notation. Let's put it that way. However, once you say that, there is present in the pyramid a kind of Gödelian, to refer to the mathematician Kurt Gödel. There's a kind of Gödelian incompleteness about the Great Pyramid. And in that sense, yes, I think that there's a kind of Boolean structure to it. To clarify what I'm saying, if you look at Kurt Gödel's proof, it really is mind-blowing, because essentially what he's doing is he's using Boolean algebra, Boolean logic, to prove that Boolean logic is incomplete without an informal context or reference that stands outside of the propositions themselves.
Which suggests the same analogy as the observer in quantum mechanics.
Exactly. And this is what I think the pyramid is doing. This is why the deeper you probe into the structure, at least from an engineering and mathematical or cosmological point of view, the more astounding the structure becomes. This was not a bunch of Egyptians scratching things out on the desert sand and quarrying rocks and dragging them up there on ropes and pulleys.
That's almost as good as the one about the horses when the thing goes to the moon.
Well, yeah, exactly. I am amazed that people are still promulgating this idea. And let's be honest, this idea of ropes and pulleys and ramps and sleds and machines comes from Herodotus, okay?
Yeah.
And I made a point, Kelly, in the book to include, because I'm just sick of hearing about it, I made a point to include what Herodotus actually said about the Great Pyramid and how it was built. And, bless his heart, Herodotus is how to put it, he's kind of the historiographer that historians love to laugh at.
Well, he was a satirist at the same time he was a historian.
Yes, exactly. He's just relaying what he's been told. So he starts to tell about the Great Pyramid, and then he talks about how they're quarrying all these rocks and hauling them up the pyramid. Yeah. And you just have to laugh, because the first thing he says, well, they built a road to move all these rocks. And then the next thing he says, and I have to wonder, and I'm paraphrasing very badly here, but he says, I have to wonder just how long it took them to build the road, because it seems to me that the road would take about as long as the pyramid and cost about as much. And then he goes on to tell you, and by the way, here's the amount that they had to spend on onions, radishes, garlic, and something else. I forget what it was that they were feeding the people that worked on it. So,
yeah, that was the ancient Egyptian food pyramid.
Yeah, invest in radish futures now, folks.
Yeah.
And it's this astronomical amount of onions, garlic, and radishes. What a diet to be feeding people.
Yeah.
They're building such a colossal structure. And then on top of all of that, he says, well, they're using machines to lift these rocks. And you read him, and he actually says, and they put these machines up there and they're lifting these rocks. And then when they get one layer done, then they move the machines one level lower, and so in other words, they're building the dang things from the top down, And, you just have to know that Herodotus is having a little chuckle here,
Yeah.
because how assuming that they built the rest of the structure, and assuming that he's talking about laying the casing stones on the outer surface of the structure, and they're doing it top down. you know
Yeah.
you just get this feeling that he's having his little chuckle. But
Yeah.
at the end of all this, he insists with absolute seriousness that, I'm relaying it exactly as they told it to me.
Oh my God, that's funny.
It is. And it's, this has been the story in one form or fashion ever since. So, in
Wow.
other words, Egyptology and their explanation for the construction of this enormous building
Yeah.
it was born with Herodotus. Now, I'm sorry, I don't know how the Great Pyramid was built. I don't.
Does it have a central column?
We don't know. That's the other thing. They keep talking about radar tomography and all of this, but we don't know what the internal core of the structure actually looks like.
I saw
simply
some
don't.
pictures of the top, of the Great Pyramid, and it looked to me like that it wasn't, just the bricks getting smaller as it went to the top. It looked like the granite stones are, the standard stones that being piled on. Those granite stones looked to me like they kind of like tapered off, and that there were other, it looked like granite columns going all the way down to me.
Well, there has to be some sort of load-bearing central core in that
Right.
structure that we simply are not aware of, because we can't see it, and there's no way for us to look at it.
Yeah, and so like load-bearing core, let's explain that a little bit for the audience. So if you look at the World Trade Centers, interesting analogy.
Yeah.
In the World Trade Center, there was a central column of steel beams that were like 2 feet thick, I think. They were all
Right.
strung together in the center core,
Right.
but most of the weight was borne by the skin. So the support, the steel of the outer structure was the vast majority of the support for the building. It came from the outside, which was unusual, that most buildings weren't built that way. And so what we're talking about here is the fact that you can't really have a pyramid. Japan, I think during World Expo, back in the 80s or 90s, Japan tried to build a pyramid, and they calculated it would cost like $3 million to build a pyramid for their expo. And they wound up spending, 23 or $26 million, and it wound up taking 3 years longer than they thought, which is, not what you expect from the Japanese.
Right.
And the reason is that it's extremely hard to pile bricks on top of each other in a pyramidal style and get it to be stable, unless there's a central core.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the World Trade Center, because yes, those buildings were supported by the central core and that outer load-bearing skin. So in effect, you have a cantilevered structure,
right,
in the World Trade Center. And I suspect strongly that there's some sort of cantilevering going on inside of the Great Pyramid that we cannot see.
Right.
And if you look at this apartment that just collapsed in Davenport, Iowa, I watched an expose by a fellow on YouTube by the name of Jeff Ostroff. I can't remember the exact last name, but it's about half an hour long, and he showed pictures and what they were doing of this thing. And my father, I have to tell you, my father was a construction engineer. I mean, that was his bread and butter. That's how we ate. And he went around, for the construction company he worked for, inspecting various construction projects as they were being built to make sure that they were being built correctly. And he would have, Kelly, had he seen what they were doing on that building, he would have absolutely flipped. Because, for one thing, apparently that building, that outer wall that did collapse, prior to the collapse, they show pictures of the outer wall, and there's no lintel above the windows.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So in other words, you've got windows that are acting as load-bearing elements for a brick wall. And,
Wow.
pile enough bricks on top of glass and guess what you get.
Yeah, a
And
pile of
I was
bricks.
a pile of bricks. It's
Yeah.
exact, and a lot of broken glass.
Yeah.
Kelly, I was just amazed at stupidity.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is the problem with the Great Pyramid. There's been many theories out there proposed by engineers over the years as to how these things were built, and this is my point, that so many proposals by so many engineers, and yet they all have fallen short in some form or fashion when they try to replicate using the proposals of engineers to build even the smallest pyramidal structure, not to mention one that's 450 plus feet tall,
Right.
and built out of limestone and granite on top of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is the problem. Whoever built the thing had a tremendous technical and engineering skill that we are just simply unable to replicate today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something to be aspired to, no pun intended.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So you suggested in other interviews
Uh-huh.
that it looks like the pyramid was built and then it was damaged and then it was potentially restored or rebuilt.
Yes.
Right, before it was destroyed again, and then really destroyed. Right, they destroyed the nether regions of the pyramid and all the
Mm-hmm.
devices that were apparently within it.
Mm-hmm.
Why would someone build that pyramid? To begin with, was because we had this strange situation where we've talked about this on previous podcasts,
Mm-hmm.
where the moon just sort of shows up one day. Right, someone drives it in, and there needs to be some braking force
Yeah.
in order to be able to bring it into its spectacularly aligned
Yes.
orientation to the Earth.
Right.
And so, do you think the pyramid could have been utilized in its original form to be the braking action of an arriving mini
Sure.
planet?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It could have. The reason why is that my basic working hypothesis in all of this crazy, wild speculation
Yeah.
has been that if the pyramid was a weapon, as described in some of these ancient texts,
Yeah.
how would it work? And my basic response has been, well, it would have been some form of Nikola Tesla's electroacoustic wave, or some form of Thomas Townsend Brown's gravitoacoustics,
Or Tom Bearden. Yeah.
or Tom Bearden. Yeah, it's got something to do, in other words, with a P wave or a pulse, a longitudinal pulse in the medium. Once you say longitudinal pulse in the medium, what are you saying? Well, you're saying space warp,
Yeah.
gravity waves, and
Yeah.
what have you. And once you say that, then yes, you can use those very same longitudinal pulses or waves to do other things,
Right.
like slow a planet down that's coming through and parking it, and using those waves to position it very carefully. And that's what you see with the moon.
Right.
It would be, you're using those waves to park the moon in a manner similar, in other words, to the way a surfer will use an ocean wave and just simply ride the wave.
It could be like an advanced team came down to build the pyramid for precisely that purpose because they knew the moon was arriving.
Sure, it may be. Who knows? I don't know.
Right.
The only problem with that hypothesis is the chronological problem.
Yeah.
the Vedic literature has a reference, and I forget where it is. I cited it as an epigraph in one of my books. I don't remember which one. But there's a reference in the Vedic literature that says the old moon broke.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? There's also a reference in ancient Greek mythologies about Arcadia that there is mention of a time when there was no moon. Well, that's got to be in the mists of prehistory.
Yeah.
And the Great Pyramid, is the Great Pyramid that old? Well, most people doubt it. Now, I, for one, think that the Great Pyramid is probably the oldest structure on the surface of the planet.
There's a little doubt about that.
Yeah, but how old it is, that's anybody's guess.
Yeah, in some of the materials that have been produced about Steiner, Rudolf Steiner, the 20th century mystic,
who doesn't footnote anything.
He doesn't footnote anything. Yeah, he has a special dispensation, and
With so many people. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, in his relation of his theory or of his exposition of the eighth sphere, which is this universe of evil that Satan is trying to manifest that doesn't include God. They keep talking about the worlds, and he's talking about the various, the first Earth, the second Earth, the first moon, the second moon, and then I realized as I was reading that, which I really try to avoid that kind of stuff because I don't like reading about evil, but it occurred to me that those descriptions are from the perspective of the observer. Right. So if you're talking about the first Earth, you're talking about people who were on another planet that was a place to abide, right? And an abode. And so, in the first moon, in the case of the cosmic war hypothesis, the first Earth was probably Mars. And the moon of Mars was probably Tiamat, because if you're from the perspective of Mars and there's this blue Saturn massed planet going around you, that's going to look like a giant moon.
Yeah, it's this is something that I've covered in various books, and I call it the unified intention of symbol, or to give it its academic term, it's paranomasia. And that is deliberately multi-layered language.
Right.
Where terms function intentionally on multiple levels. So let's look at the term Earth can literally mean lots of different things. It can mean any ground beneath your feet.
Correct.
So in other words, that ground beneath your feet can be the planet Mars, the planet the Moon, the planet Venus, whatever you happen to be standing on at that moment, you're standing on Earth. When you're standing on the Earth, then you're standing on this planet. And the same thing applies for terms like ocean. Ocean is the term that the ancients will use to describe outer space. It is the term that they use, obviously, to describe the oceans on this planet, and so on and so forth. So in other words, you've got to be very, very careful to understand that these ancient languages, when they're talking about these things, very often are talking about all of these possibilities simultaneously.
Yeah, I know. That's an amazing thing. If you're looking for an analog to that, to the listenership, you're looking for an analog to that, just open up the I Ching.
Right, exactly.
You have even the symbol for the I Ching. If you look at the Chinese characters, the pictographs that they use, there's a picture of a bookshelf is the first pictograph. And the second pictograph is a bird in flight. And so if you take that apart and look at it analogically, the bookshelf represents knowledge, wisdom. And if you look at the bird in flight, it represents action. And you put them together and it's storehouse of wisdom, knowledge, and action.
Right.
So that's a good way to sort of get a handle on what Joseph means by the unified intention of symbol.
Yeah, what I want people to grab here, and this is very important, is it's not simply a pictographic or ideogrammatic language that I'm talking about here, although you could certainly apply it even to kineograms themselves if you look at them carefully, because very often you'll discover that they're early versions of Chinese ideograms. But
Interesting.
more specifically, what I'm talking about is the words themselves. Words like horizon,
Right.
earth, ocean, and things of
Star.
this sort. Star, planet,
Yeah.
all of these types of things.
Primary language.
Mountain, the
Right.
mountain is one of those that has a rich use depending on its context, because the word mountain can mean a planet or a mound or a pyramid or a hill or a ziggurat. It means all of these things.
Yeah, like the word massif, Massif.
Right. So that people have to be very, very careful. And I'm definitely of the Herita von Deken, Georgios de Santillana, Hamlet's Mill school here, is that these myths are deliberately encoded, multi-layered things that only begin to make real sense as scientific culture becomes more involved and deeper.
Right.
The
You could
more,
literally have 5 narratives taking place within one story.
yes, exactly. It's a very to put it in musical terms, it's a very contrapuntal type of language, and
Does the great Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
it begins to make more sense the more science you have.
Right.
This is the paradoxical thing about these ancient myths, is they really have only started to be decoded and uncovered as our science as we began to enter a modern scientific culture right around the time of the Renaissance.
Now, no, you've talked before about in your work about Noam Chomsky and grammar, and what we mean for the audience. What we mean about grammar is the structure of how logos is drawn together, right, and expressed, right. It's the order of operations, if you will, of the thinking process, right? So is there a grammar in the Great Pyramid?
Wow. Yes, I definitely think so. If you're looking for a structure or an ordered operation of functions, an algorithm, so to speak, that's present in the structure, I definitely think so, because when you look at those dimensional analogs that are present in the structure, there is something that immediately begins to happen the more you look at it. And I'm going to suggest that there are actually, two very different, broadly speaking, sets of algorithms in that structure that drive you in a certain direction. The first set is when you look at the pyramid and understand my hypothesis for dealing with what I think it was doing. And you have to understand that my hypothesis is incomplete, okay? But even in its incomplete state, one version of this hypothesis is saying that it is creating a longitudinal pulse within the structure that, in typical fashion, begins at the bottom of the pyramid and moves towards the top. It's that simple, and that's an algorithm. That's a set of functions.
As below, so above.
Right. And as it moves through the structure, as that pulse moves through the structure, it becomes more and more concentrated because the surface area over which the pulse or through which the pulse is moving becomes less and less. And therefore, the energy is stepped up. So in other words, it's acting like a transformer.
Like a rectifier.
Well, like a rectifier, like a transformer in a certain sense. It's stepping things up. Now, the other way that you have to look at the pyramid in terms of these pulses is quite literally as you progress from the exterior of the pyramid towards the interior. And particularly as you advance upward from that system of plugs and passages that lead into the grand gallery. And then you go up the grand gallery into the antechamber and then finally on into the king's chamber. What you discover when you look at the dimensional measures of all those structures is as you proceed, the dimensional measures become harmonics that are stepped up from the grand gallery into the king's chamber. So again, you're watching a system of harmonics deliberately designed to take a pulse and step it up as you proceed from the external part of the pyramid to the internal part of the pyramid. So yes, I absolutely think that your question is sound, that there's a kind of grammar at work inside the structure that is shaping the functions and driving them in a certain vector of operation.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, again, this is a structure that is engineered to the hilt. It's just hard to put into words how complex and engineered this structure really is.
Wow. So in your book, you use the mathematical expression pi over 2 in the second part. Can you explain how pi over 2 applies to the function of the Great Pyramid?
In two ways. The first is that Tesla, in his Colorado Springs experiments, where he's actually experimenting with this phenomenon of electrical pulses that move over the surface of his coils, not through the wires in them. Okay, this is what most people don't understand about what he's doing. And as a result of doing these experiments, he calculates the velocity of these longitudinal pulses to be pi divided by 2 times the velocity of light. So in other words, what he's telling you is that the pulse itself is moving at superluminal velocity. That's what he's saying.
Right. So he has basically his own law of induction.
Yes, exactly.
So for the audience, induction is the impulse to movement.
Right.
And so James Clerk Maxwell defined the law of induction in one way inside electromagnetic circuits. And then the Laplacian transform was used to codify that further by Einstein. But the Laplace transform itself it's a mathematical trick, an accounting trick that physicists use to make equations work, to make the math come out. But it's a subluminal architecture. So it inherently limits you to subluminal speeds when you apply the Laplace transform, for example, in the theory of special relativity. But you're saying that Tesla's, and of course Einstein had access to Tesla's material.
Yes.
Right. So he knew that there was another law of induction, and decided that he wasn't going to go anywhere near it.
Right.
That's very interesting by itself.
It's extremely interesting because, in effect, what the Laplace transforms and all of the electromagnetics that you're talking about are basically concerned with Hertzian waves
Right.
They are not concerned with longitudinal waves, and this,
Right.
this is the bread and butter for Tesla.
Right.
In fact, it's if you look at Tesla from that point of view, what he's doing with his Colorado Springs experiments is he's utterly abandoning his experiment and concentration on Hertzian type of electromagnetic phenomena
Yeah.
altogether, and he's
Right.
saying no, this is not the whole spectrum of electromagnetic phenomena. There's something far more interesting here with these electroacoustic pulses.
All right. So
So
for those of you that are following along at home, imagine you've got a hammer in your hand and there's an anvil and you're going to strike the anvil with the hammer, right? So you raise the hammer, you slam it down, it goes bang, right? And there's a tremendous amount of force from the hammer that has been just transmitted to the anvil. And then there's this fantastic noise. Basically, what Joseph is saying is that the transverse waves are the noise from the real event, which was the act of the energy being transmitted from the hammer to the anvil.
right.
Right? So basically, all of modern electronics is based on the noise from the real event and organizing that noise rather than focusing on the real event itself.
Right.
Which is the scalar longitudinal pulse event that is happening alongside every single one of these phenomena.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about that for a minute.
Well, it means effectively, Kelly, that we're dealing with the physics, if I can put it, we're dealing with the physics of the 1%.
Yeah. Right.
And this is going to become much more clear in the second book that we're waiting to come out. But for a moment, let's get back to pi divided by 2.
Okay, very good.
Because I didn't finish the other half of where pi divided by 2 is coming from.
Yeah.
If you go to the Soviet era research on pyramids, the Soviets, there's this whole body of pyramid research that took place in the Soviet Union. At the time, it was highly top secret that they were doing this. You had to have clearance to get access to this stuff. But the Soviets built all these big fiberglass pyramids outside of Moscow, and they built them in different dimensions, sizes, shapes, and so on, because, they wanted to get to the bottom of just exactly what's going on in these dang things. And the Soviets discovered something that I think is, and I put this in the book, that I think is just absolutely fascinating. They discovered that very tall, narrow pyramids, like an Egyptian obelisk, function like antenna. They broadcast things.
Kind of like the Washington Monument. What is it broadcasting down there? I shudder to think about it.
Well, again, the primary waves that are being affected are longitudinal. Okay.
Right.
Because it's the geometry, it's the shape itself that's driving these pulses. This is we're thinking entirely analogically here.
Right, like a telegraph,
like a telegraph.
That's a pulse model.
That's a pulse, right?
Yeah.
They also discovered that very flat pyramids are, like the pyramids at Saqqara, the bent pyramid, the step pyramid. So that these types of pyramids are collectors. They're like a big parabolic dish.
Yeah.
They collect things. Then there is exactly in the middle between the two, where the height of the pyramid divided by its base is exactly in the ratio of pi divided by 2. that shape, that precise ratio or proportion can function efficiently in both modalities.
Wow.
So in other words, it's that pi divided by 2.
Right.
that is for me one of the little signals that whatever's going on in the Great Pyramid, it's got something to do with these laws of induction of longitudinal waves that Tesla was experimenting with.
Right. And
Now, exactly what I don't know, but the
yeah.
clue is there.
Yeah, like if you look at the early radar systems that were designed by the British for World War II, they had an antenna for transmitting and then a totally separate, different designed antenna for reception.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And it wasn't until Fort Monmouth, by the way, it wasn't until Fort Monmouth figured out that if they used pulsed switching inside a vacuum tube, they could have a single radar dish that would perform both functions of sending and receiving by switching that vacuum tube using a longitudinal pulse.
Yes, ding, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. And let's go further since we're talking about radar.
Yeah.
Because I want to clear up once and for all a misconception that people have about radar and what it does and how it works. We have the idea that radar is a reflection. It is not a reflection. That pulse, folks, is stimulating, that longitudinal pulse that you're sending out is stimulating an electrical current in the object that is painted by that pulse. Yeah. And that current is what you are picking up as the so-called reflection. Yeah. It's not a bounce, in other words. It's not a transmitter. It's a secondary transmitter effect.
Yeah, a repeater. A repeater.
A repeater. Ding, ding, ding. Yes.
And that's fascinating, which explains why they've gone to such lengths with stealth to do things like embedding nano-sized iron.
Because what they're trying to do is turn off that secondary transmitter effect. And I guarantee you that effect can be picked up simply by resonance if you know how to do it. So what I'm also telling you folks is forget about this idea of completely stealthy aircraft. Ain't going to happen.
Yep. Very interesting. And no matter how they tried, they couldn't get it smaller than like a bird.
Yep, exactly.
And if it's a bird moving at 500 miles an hour, it's not a bird.
It's not a bird. unless it's a kind of bird we haven't seen here before.
Yeah, they've retired all those F-117s, the original, geometric stealth fighters. Yeah. And they never really explained why they did that.
Well, it's because the Russians figured out how to defeat them.
Oh,
I mean, come on here, folks. The Russians, like it or not, don't study physics in American schools. This is.
Are there any aircraft that could utilize the Philadelphia experiment technology for obfuscation?
Oh, I think probably they have them already.
Yeah.
I have my suspicions about the B-2 stealth bomber and how exactly that thing works. For one thing, I've had suspicions, Kelly, for a very long time watching them, that their takeoff runs are far too short for an aircraft that size.
Yeah.
In other words, if you're getting up there in the air simply on the basis of the jet engine, then I would expect the takeoff runs of those things would be a lot longer than they are.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, which reminds me of a certain other aircraft that or spacecraft that took off from the moon rather quickly.
Yeah, ding, ding, ding. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think and I'm not alone in this. There are many people that think this. I think there's an electrogravitic component to the stealth bomber that uses.
What's that fog that sometimes hangs across the top of that aircraft?
Well, that's ionization.
Right.
And I think what's going on in that aircraft is it's got an electrical dipole. So you've got a positive leading edge on the lift surfaces, and then you've got the jets themselves spewing out electrons. So you're creating a dipole condition, a bubble around the aircraft that is literally a plasma.
Right. I was going to say.
And once you have that plasma, then you have a different kind of stealthiness
Right.
than the kind of stealth, altogether different kind than the kind of stealth that you've got with the F-117.
And if you pulse the plasma, you could
Exactly.
conjugate with a pulsed plasma
Yes.
to have it transmitting no signature at all. In other words, use it as
Right.
like active noise cancellation. It's
Right.
technology they use in a lot in airplanes and sometimes in cars,
Right.
where it listens to what's going on and it puts out the inverse
Right.
waveform, and you
Right.
get vastly reduced sound or noise in the environment.
Precisely.
Right.
Precisely.
So
This
you could
is
do the same
exact.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm arguing that basically they're surrounding the craft with a plasma sheath,
Yeah.
which increases its stealthy properties and decreases its drag properties, and therefore increases the lift efficiency of the lifting body.
Right.
And it might even account for the tremendous long range of the craft.
Yeah.
There are even people, and I'm not saying anything that other people have not said in relation to
Of
this
course.
aircraft,
Yeah.
but there are people out there, Kelly, that think that the jets in the craft are really only used to get it up there and down, but that once it's up there, it functions entirely through this electrical dipole.
Yeah, they fly nonstop, non-refueled from
Right,
Whiteman or Montana all the
right,
way to Diego Garcia.
right, right. Yeah, and that's just absurd for a any sort of conventional aircraft of that size that has the payload that it does to carry enough fuel to do that.
Yeah,
So
especially without refueling.
yeah, that's the point. So yeah, there's something else going on in that aircraft that doesn't meet the eye,
Yeah,
uh, and like you, I suspect it has a lot to do with lunar excursion modules
yeah,
and
yeah,
deals post-war deals with the Nazi devil.
yeah, yeah. We will give you the technology, but
Well, yeah, but we move on to a few things. Well, here's the thing, since we're talking about that, the basic technique that I just outlined for the B-2 stealth bomber, creating this electrical dipole plasma sheath condition around it.
yeah,
The idea for using jet engines in that way actually came up. The American scientist that came up with it was Thomas Townsend Brown
wow,
in the late 1940s and early 50s. And
yeah.
interestingly enough, the first operational jet fighter in the world was the Messerschmitt 262.
I think it was the Henkel. I think there
Well,
was a
yeah,
Henkel. Yeah.
I said operational. There
Oh,
were,
okay.
there was what's his name, Whittle in England, and
Yeah, yeah.
other people experimenting with
Well,
jets in
yeah.
Germany. But
Henkel apparently the Nazis didn't like Henkel, so they gave it to Messerschmitt.
yeah,
Yeah.
but basically there was a German scientist that was, helping them with their jet engines that came up
Helm,
with
I
the
think his name.
exact same idea that
Yeah.
Townsend Brown came up with.
Oh, wow.
So in other words, the idea has been out there for a very long time.
Right.
It's not new. It's nothing new. And again, both men were thinking in terms of improving lift efficiency and creating a kind of plasma sheath around an aircraft for stealthiness. So again, this is nothing new. This is just basic junior high school physics that these people are playing around with.
Yeah, it's really really fascinating. So you described in your book Revisited certain experiments that happened. Again, I'm changing the subject a little bit, but certain experiments that happened at, speaking of Fort Monmouth again, that happened there with respect to hydrogen and anvil presses.
Oh boy.
So, do you know who the scientists were who were involved in that?
Well, the one that the one, I think I know which one you're talking about, and why you're talking about it.
Yeah.
Because Fort Monmouth, to me, the more I dig into this place, the more I'm just there's something going on there.
Yeah.
I wrote that whole book, McCarthy, Monmouth, and the Deep State, about Senator Joseph McCarthy probing into security risks at Fort Monmouth. And this was, of course, the probe that finally convinced the United States Army that this man has to be shut down. Because when you read the transcripts, which incidentally, folks, were only declassified in 2003.
Yeah.
Okay. So go read my Monmouth and McCarthy book, please, because what you have been told about why he was shut down is a complete fabrication. Okay.
Yeah.
That it has nothing to do with him smearing anybody or any of that. He was getting too close to things that the Army did not want to be talking about publicly.
Yeah, he made a JFK mistake, but he got everybody mad at him at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. That was the basic problem.
Yeah, that's the number one rule in politics, is don't get everybody mad at you at the same time.
At the same time. Yes, particularly when you have Roy Cohn as your chief counsel. But anyway.
Yeah.
At Fort Monmouth, shortly after the period of time that he was investigating it, and I say shortly because I'm convinced that this research was going on there during the time that he was investigating it. But shortly after he was investigating Fort Monmouth, there were experiments in extremely high pressure physics that were being run at Fort Monmouth using diamond anvil presses. Now, if people don't know what a diamond anvil press is, imagine taking two brilliant cut diamonds, and the very points of those diamonds, imagine putting those 2 points together in such a fashion that there's a little hollow area that's created when those 2 points are brought together.
Yeah, like a cup. Half a cup.
Like a cup. And then you begin to, under a hydraulic press, you begin to squeeze those two diamonds together.
Yeah.
Now, we all know what a diamond is. It's the hardest substance naturally occurring on this planet. So the hydraulic press is going to create a little zone of extraordinarily high pressure where those two diamonds come together. We're talking in terms of hundreds of thousands of atmospheres of pressure.
Yeah, like a mountain sitting on top of the diamond anvil press.
Right, exactly. And under those conditions, normal elements like hydrogen begin to undergo profound phase transitions, such that an element like hydrogen can become metallic, or an element like zinc or something will have its lattice structure so compressed and changed that it might become a metamaterial,
Right.
a material with an extraordinarily weird set of lattice properties. So a diamond anvil press is kind of the key to the technology tree of creating these exotic metamaterials that you create out of extraordinarily high pressures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fortunately, until very recently, diamond anvil presses could only make such materials based on the fact that very small diamonds are normally, what are used. We don't have diamond anvil presses using things, for example, like the Star of Africa, that gigantic 200 plus carat diamond that's in the British Royal Scepter,
Yeah.
you mean
that heavy thing?
Yeah, that heavy thing. Well, as a matter of fact, until very recently, we did not have the ability to make synthetic diamonds that were that large. Now, I know you sent me a bunch of articles where apparently they have been making extraordinarily large synthetic diamonds. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking that the reason that they're making these extraordinarily large synthetic diamonds is so that they can make extraordinarily large synthetic diamond anvil presses so that they can make metamaterial super compressed lattice structure type of stuff on an industrial scale. Okay.
Yeah, and they also
So,
use it for imagine computers with
right,
logic
exactly.
gates
Right,
that are, diamond based,
right, exactly.
would be able to take extraordinary amounts of heat.
Extraordinary amounts of heat, and they would be able to function under extraordinary pressures.
Right.
This is, there's a military game going on here, in other words,
Uh-huh.
folks. Well,
Yeah, well,
anyway,
yeah,
going back
the
to,
Portland facility is funded by De Beers, which
yeah,
is
I know it is.
somewhat known in the diamond world.
Somewhat.
Yeah.
Somewhat. But let's go back to Fort Monmouth. One of the individuals that was involved in this research in the late 50s at Fort Monmouth was a Lieutenant Tidings. Now, for
Comfort and
anybody,
joy. Comfort and joy.
no,
Like,
not Tidings. No, for anybody that's familiar with the story of Senator Joseph McCarthy, the name Tidings, Tydings,
yeah.
is going to be very familiar because it was Senator Millard Tidings of Maryland that McCarthy first tangled with in that whole McCarthy Tidings Committee hearing flap. And
Was that the
incidentally,
Government Oversight Committee or the Committee on Investigation?
no. This was the Tidings Committee was specially created by Congress, by the Senate,
Uh-huh.
to investigate McCarthy's claims that he made in the speech at Wheeling, West Virginia,
On the
that he
communist.
had a list of communists in the government that
Right.
were still operating in sensitive positions long after they appeared on lists of security risks. And of course, the Tidings Committee, Millard Tidings, the history books, Kelly, present the Tidings Committee as a huge defeat for Joseph McCarthy. Well, it was anything but that, because Tidings made the claim to have the original recording of the speech from the radio station in Wheeling, West Virginia, that McCarthy made his speech at. And of course, the radio station, and Tidings made this claim on the U.S. Senate floor and offered to play the recording. And that's when McCarthy got him, because, of course, there was no recording. Tidings didn't have a recording. He showed a record, but it wasn't the record of McCarthy's speech. It couldn't have been.
Wow.
And, of course, McCarthy said, go ahead and play it. And, of course, at that point, the hijinks started and the wiffle waffles started. Well, end of the story was Millard Tidings was not reelected to the Senate in
Wow.
1952, which was the year that McCarthy, of course, was reelected and went on to become the chairman of the Government Operations Committee and began looking into Fort Monmouth.
Wow.
So I suspect that this Lieutenant Tidings at Fort Monmouth may have something else to do with this story.
That's fascinating.
Maybe he's a relation to Senator Tidings. I don't know. I haven't been able to find out
Where
yet.
was Tidings from? Is he from Maryland?
Maryland, yes.
Yeah.
Maryland. Democratic senator from Maryland. And I believe at the time that Senator Tidings was the senior senator from Maryland, so he had been there in the Senate.
Well, there's another important Army post down there. Isn't there an arsenal down there where they develop weaponry in Maryland?
In Maryland, yes, the U.S. Naval Testing Laboratory and so on. In fact, that whole naval aspect of the story is based there in Maryland. I talk about Townsend Brown and his work.
Yeah, so to provide some context, you have this masculine, aggressive lawyer from Wisconsin Judge McCarthy becomes Senator McCarthy,
Right.
who is looking at what he regards as deception and
Security risks.
secrecy,
Right.
at the same time that he's also finding out that the U.S. government is thoroughly, as the Venona transcripts confirm, it was thoroughly penetrated by Marxists,
Right.
right,
Right.
who were
Right.
looking to undermine the system of the United States because they think their system's better.
Right.
And so he's got these two twin probes going on, and then he starts in I think these meetings took place in Federal Hall in Manhattan. Am I correct?
Well, some of the Monmouth investigations were held. The actual committee hearings were held at Federal Hall in New York
On
City
Wall Street.
on Wall Street. Yeah,
Yeah.
they moved the venue of the hearings, and in many of those cases, it's the subcommittee of McCarthy's committee that is meeting and conducting those aspects of the hearings. In some of those cases, McCarthy is personally present. In some of those cases, the committee is meeting under the chairmanship of Roy Cohn.
What were some of the things that McCarthy asked about in his own questions?
In his own questions,
Yeah.
many things. He asked specifically about the Fort losing certain top secret documents that had been recorded on the documents register, but that they could not produce the documents. And in some cases, these questions went directly to something that McCarthy in the transcripts is calling Blue Book. In other words, that's Air Force Project Blue Book on the UFO.
Yeah, we've heard that before.
And and this is what really dumbfounded me when I started reading these transcripts. The other things that McCarthy is asking about in these transcripts directly, and this is a key thing for people to latch on to here. McCarthy is asking about trips that the radar scientists at Monmouth are making to New Mexico in July, and he's mentioning the date and time here.
Whoa.
This is really important for people
We're talking about 1947?
July of 1947. So in other words, folks, what I'm telling you is Senator Joseph McCarthy is dropping very strong hints in the transcripts about Roswell.
Wow.
And the presence of top secret radar research scientists being present in New Mexico at that time. And let's remember that these hearings are taking place in 1952.
Wow.
At the time period when Washington, D.C. itself is experiencing that 1952 UFO flap.
Yeah.
And, McCarthy could not have helped but hear about it. And the flap was so big that the Air Force General Sanford, Major General Sanford, had to go on television and the newsreels and the radio stations at that time and reassure everybody in a press conference that, no, there was nothing extraordinary that happened here. And, we got the usual song and dance that this was swamp gas and nothing to be worried about, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. But, there was independent corroboration of the association between what was happening in Fort Monmouth and New Mexico. Yeah, one of the people who worked at Fort Monmouth was a Major Zoll, who was a scientist there. And in his biography, Electrons Away, which you can find on Amazon, used, he describes his many trips to New Mexico. And he was even present at the testing of the atomic artillery, the atomic cannon that they developed. And he was also later on at Bikini Atoll. So we know that these Fort Monmouth scientists are connected with the atomic program.
Oh yes, absolutely.
It's been confirmed publicly.
McCarthy in the transcripts, in the Fort Monmouth transcripts, is asking about this atomic cannon as well.
Oh, interesting.
So it's there, and folks, you've just got to read these transcripts. I reproduce them at great length in my Monmouth, McCarthy, and the Deep State book, because it's very clear that he's onto very different things, and that this is really the reason that the Army sets him up in the Army McCarthy hearings. They just don't want him probing this area at all, and they take him out. Basically, they take him out.
Wow.
Yeah, it's got nothing to do with the standard narrative that we hear in school. Nothing whatsoever to do with it.
Yeah, apparently he does have some decency.
Well, don't get me started on that episode.
Yeah.
Because that whole thing with Welch in the Army McCarthy hearings, I go into that as well in the book, and I'll just let people read the book, because even McCarthy detractors have had to come clean on that one in reading.
Yeah, well, it was an Army guy that laid that down at the very time that the Army was trying to stop the other thing.
Yeah, whole, basically, the Army McCarthy hearings were a set of theater that were designed to have McCarthy discredited on national television. And the problem was, if you can find the Army McCarthy hearings in their entirety, and not just that little episode with Joseph Welch.
Yeah.
The problem is that McCarthy was really kind of holding his own throughout most of those hearings. They went on for weeks.
Wow.
And they weren't, the Army wasn't getting anywhere in trying to destroy him.
Wow.
And so finally you had that little bit of theater that Welch pulled. And that was what did it. The other thing that you have to look at with the Army McCarthy hearings is the whole business with Roy Cohn and Ray Shine. Because it was fairly obvious, although no one was saying it, that this was a little homosexual network going on. And that was the other thing that was finally played up to a great extent by some of the council, the committee's counsel in front of national television. So,
wow.
The whole thing was a big circus for television, basically. You just have to read the book to see what went on. There was a lot of behind the scenes chicanery that happened before that famous scene between Joseph Welch and Joseph Welch and Joseph McCarthy.
Yeah,
a lot of stuff that happened prior to that.
Wow. And there was also an Army general in charge of the White House at the time too.
Yes.
What did Eisenhower say about all this stuff?
Well, Eisenhower did not like Joseph McCarthy. At the 52 Republican convention, McCarthy was one of the keynote speakers at the 52 Republican convention, largely because he was so widely popular in the country at the time. He was kind of, the teabag Republican, MAGA Republican of that era. And therefore Eisenhower had to invite him, to be a keynote speaker. But personally, Eisenhower hated him. Could not stand Joseph McCarthy. And that was pretty much when McCarthy started the Monmouth hearings and exposing all of the lax security at that base. The Army, he was getting into some very sensitive areas. and the Army just shut him down. There's no doubt in my mind that was the reason why they took the action that
If
they
you look
did.
at the commanders at Fort Monmouth, you see that some of them were in there for a long time, and some of them were in there for a shorter time, and some
Yeah.
of them were in there for a really short time. Like
Right.
from April 46 to June 47,
Yes.
they had Brigadier General Matejka, and then from 47 to 51, they had Francis Lanahan, Major General, right? And then from 51, April, from June to 47 to April 51, and then you had Brigadier General Reichelderfer in there from April 51 to December 51. And then you had someone else from December 51 to August 54. So there was a really astonishing turnover from 51. They went from, they had 3 different people in there in the year in 1951. Right. And then they had, there was turnover going on at the top when this was going on.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I find very interesting. But Eisenhower had his own problems with the breakaway group, didn't he?
Well, in my opinion, yes. It's really the breakaway group that I think is even pushing Eisenhower himself.
Right.
And particularly with respect to the UFO issue, this is what I think is really driving all of this at the time.
Interesting.
Including McCarthy's brushes with it, because it's very clear in the transcripts that what McCarthy is. You have to read those transcripts with the realization that, number one, McCarthy is a trained lawyer, and number two, he's the chairman of a very powerful Senate committee, the Senate Government Operations Committee, that has the power to review all government operations. And so therefore, McCarthy, when he is asking questions that he knows is getting in to the area, or actually treading on the area of classified information, McCarthy will have to ask his questions in a roundabout way.
Right.
And this is exactly what you see him doing, so that he can get things on the record, but he doesn't have to mention, is this about the crash flying saucer in Roswell, New Mexico in July of 19? No, he's not going to ask a question that way, because the moment he does, it becomes classified and he has to go into executive session. And this is the other thing that you see him doing throughout his career in the Senate, is if it is a witness who is providing testimony that is of that kind of nature, he will go into executive session. So in other words, the idea of McCarthy smearing people openly is about the last thing you find him doing. And if he is required to go into executive session, he does it. But if he's in open session in these committee hearings and talking about sensitive issues, you will see him asking questions that are clearly referring to things that we know now, but he's going to do it in a roundabout way. So in other words, when he wants to talk about Roswell and the incident there, he'll start talking about, this was in July of 47, correct? Yes, Senator, that's correct. And this was in New Mexico at that time. Is that correct? Yes, Senator, that's correct. So in other words, this is the way he approaches things. He's a lawyer, and he's asking questions of a factual nature to get them into the transcript record. That's always his approach. Always.
Any good prosecutor knows how to box people in.
Right, exactly. And he is a very good prosecutor.
Yeah.
Well, he knows how to do it. He was a judge. Yes, precisely.
So he sat on the other side of the bench too. So he's been evaluating evidence for a very long time.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing that people have to watch out for in those books, and particularly in the second book, I wrote a second sequel book to Monmouth, McCarthy, and the Deep State, and in that second book about McCarthy, I go into his speech on the floor of the Senate regarding Secretary Marshall.
Oh, the
George Marshall.
Merovingian speech.
The the infamous Merovingian speech.
Yeah, can you explain that speech? Or
Well,
what you mean by
McCarthy
it?
again. This is
Yeah,
one of the strangest things anyone could ever say on the floor of the United States Senate. McCarthy gave a very famous speech in 1951 about the career of George Marshall
yeah,
and questioning some of Marshall's military decisions and so on and so forth. And quite frankly, I have to agree with McCarthy as to some of the questions that he had regarding Marshall. For example, McCarthy was wondering why the heck did Secretary Marshall approve the invasion of southern France in August of 1944. It makes no military sense, and McCarthy points out that it made no military sense to the American general that was the commander-in-chief of Allied forces in Italy at the end of the war,
yeah,
General Mark Clark.
yeah.
General Clark
also,
said the same.
Yeah, it also
Well,
reminds me of a certain crusade.
well, yeah, I was getting there if I can get there.
Yeah.
But McCarthy's point is that the invasion of southern France was unnecessary militarily. And then he, at the end of this absolutely blistering examination of General Marshall's career, and again, I'll be honest, folks, I have asked the same questions that McCarthy asked all those decades ago on the floor of the Senate. Why was this man a mere colonel with a dodgy record of command prior to his appointment as commander-in-chief of the U.S. military by President Roosevelt? Why was he elevated over so many other contenders?
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of his speech, he says something to the effect that, well, to answer this question, basically only the Merovingian in the White House knows.
Oh my gosh. So he's claiming that Harry Truman's a Merovingian?
Well, he certainly acts like it, but for crying out loud, you can Kelly, you can just see the expression on the other senators' faces as they're listening to this, and they're turning to each other and asking, "What the hell is a Merovingian?"
Yeah, right.
Where's this coming from?
You could see Harry Truman's haberdasher hat popping off his head when he heard that one.
Yeah, well, what? Well, the reference to Merovingian is the reference to the original dynasty of France,
Interesting.
the Merovingian kings.
Wow.
That preceded the papal anointing of the House of Charlemagne.
Oh, wow.
So this, for McCarthy to refer to the Merovingians is a very obscure, esoteric reference. And again, this is a man that does not choose his words loosely or lightly. So he's sending a clear message there.
Yeah.
The question is, what's the message?
Yeah.
Well, here's the other thing. McCarthy, during the height of, I don't even know how he got off on Senator McCarthy.
Yeah.
But he's a fascinating guy. In 1954, he republishes that entire speech that he gave on the floor of the U.S. Senate, which is republished by McCarthy in a little book. And in the republished version in 1954, and that, again, is the year that the Army McCarthy hearings are at their height.
Right.
So, in other words, McCarthy republishes the speech during the height of his contest with the U.S. Army. He republishes that entire speech, but he adds new material.
Oh.
And in the new material that he adds, he points out that General Marshall, and again, Kelly, I'm absolutely certain that McCarthy is letting out a bit of information here that, again, is coming to him via Herbert Hoover and the Venona transcripts.
Wow.
Because in the published book, he points out that when the new Soviet ambassador came to Washington, D.C. during World War II, during the period that America was being attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor.
So Pearl Harbor's going on and somebody's flying into Washington.
And someone's flying into Washington, the new Soviet ambassador. Guess who was at the airport, McCarthy said, based on an obscure source, to pick him up?
Who would that be?
General George C. Marshall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he just sort of puts that out there.
Well, let's unpack that. Let's unpack that for a second. So,
well, that's a zinger.
Yeah, like for example, that would mean the Soviet ambassador would have been told to come
right
before Pearl Harbor's attacked, because it took a long time back then.
Well, and the other thing it implies is, why isn't there a delegation there? And why isn't this meeting, public with the press, with photographs and so on? Why isn't General Marshall alone picking up the Soviet ambassador?
Wow, it's a hell of a taxi driver.
That's a heck of a taxi driver.
And was he a general at that moment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had been skipped. And McCarthy, the pages that he adds to his speech as he goes into General Marshall's previous commands, where not even Douglas MacArthur was willing to sign off on this man being promoted to general rank.
Wow.
So in other words, that 16 extra pages is going over Marshall's less than stunning record as a commander, prior to Roosevelt skipping him over everybody else to become the supreme commander-in-chief operationally of American forces during World War II.
Yeah, his history goes back pretty long way, all the way back to Fort Riley.
Yeah, ding, ding, ding.
Yeah, and just for the people who don't know, Fort Riley was an army camp in Kansas.
Still,
that played a certain role in World War One.
Well, it played a certain role in vaccinating people against the flu.
And what animal were they using to incubate?
I don't remember, but my point that I was getting to is that after these vaccine trials, the Spanish flu epidemic breaks out. And guess who's in command of Fort Riley at that time?
Who?
George C. Marshall.
Interesting. And he was a cavalry guy, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And I think they were using horses to do the incubation.
Yeah, I think so, if I recall, but I don't recall that aspect of the story.
And who funded that operation, that vaccine trial?
As far as I remember, the army did. But again, I don't. This is way off where I expected.
No, I know. I just want to go down to the bottom of it, and then we can go somewhere else.
Well, I don't remember.
There's a report. There's a report that it was a certain New York-based foundation.
Well, if it's the same foundation that I'm thinking of, it wouldn't surprise me.
Right.
It would not surprise me.
Right.
But again, my point here was that this was extraordinarily hot stuff to be releasing.
Yeah.
in 1954, right at the height of a life and death struggle on national television with the U.S. Army. He was not the sort of individual to back down from a fight.
No, definitely not. So he seems to have been on good terms with Nixon. Last time we spoke, we described, a particular meeting with Drew Pearson in the coat room of a restaurant. So, do we have any information on what McCarthy and Nixon's relationship was on a wider sense?
Well, no, other than, they probably both knew each other. They were both certainly well-known anti-communists at that period in American
Right.
politics. So naturally they would have been cooperative.
So
Uh,
did McCarthy ask anything during his subcommittee hearings on certain you know office supply named projects like paperclip?
um, Not to my knowledge. However, there is an incident in the Monmouth hearing transcripts where there was the involvement of a German radar specialist, or at least someone that claimed to be a radar specialist, that was offering secrets to the American government. And McCarthy does try to get to the bottom of that, and it's very clear from the Army's responses that they're kind of giving him the runaround as to what the relationship with this individual was.
Oh, that's interesting.
Uh,
In Major Zoll's biography, he does talk about the fact that there were any number of German paperclip scientists at Fort Monmouth, and he
oh
just
yeah, that's not surprising to me.
and he describes it. He says, we have a whole bunch of Germans around here that are just getting to know American culture, and we're basically going to take a wait and see attitude towards our new German friends.
Yeah, well, one of McCarthy's most infamous claims to fame was that when he was serving his first term as senator, he was invited to participate in the Senate committee hearings regarding the Malmedy massacre that occurred during the Battle of the Bulge.
Mm.
And of course, some of the German SS participants in that massacre were sentenced by military tribunal and executed. And then some of them were tortured to get confessions about the massacre. McCarthy actually defended those defendants and their claims
Wow.
of torture in that Senate hearing committee.
Wow.
Because again, as far as he was concerned, they were denied due process.
Interesting.
So he was for a while very unpopular in the press, and even much more so in the Senate because of that stance.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the first time that he opened his mouth and put his big fat foot in it. If you want a comparison of McCarthy to contemporary political figures, the closest person I can think of to McCarthy is Donald Trump. The difference being that I think McCarthy was probably a much smarter man than Donald Trump. But he has this.
Except that Trump is still with us.
Except that Trump is still with us. McCarthy had this similar characteristic of not being able to control his temper and just blurting things out.
Yeah.
And in that respect, they're very similar characters.
Right.
But
bombastic.
But McCarthy is much more. McCarthy reserves his bombast when he's off the Senate floor or out of committee hearings. In other words, it doesn't accompany him on formal occasions.
Yeah, he doesn't. He has good impulse control.
He has. I would say he has better impulse control. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was good.
Yeah. So was there any pyramid research going on in that period of time in the U.S.? You mentioned the Russian pyramid experiments. Was there any?
Well, no, not on any official level. And as far as I know, the official interest in the pyramids begins in this country in the 60s.
Interesting.
And again, it's not really official, because what happens is you have certain people that go to Giza and conduct studies.
Right.
but they're doing so ostensibly as part of private university grants and so on and so forth. But it's an interesting list of people nonetheless, because you have people like Luis Alvarez doing, yeah, you know who he is,
Yeah.
doing pyramid studies. You've got people like Lambert Dolphin, the physicist that, eventually connects up with SRI.
Wow.
Who incidentally has all of these strange evangelical Christian beliefs on top of everything. You've got, there's another physicist, Farouk Elbaz, that is the NASA guy that has also did some work at Giza. So you certainly have American physicists interested in the Great Pyramid and in the Pyramid of Sefron, which is the other big pyramid at Giza. Yeah. But it's never in any capacity where what they're doing there at that time is directly connected to the U.S. government.
Yeah, so there's nothing really systematic. Like, it seems like the Russians were really systematic about it.
The Russians were very systematic with it, as they would be. I suspect that these studies by American scientists are part of something much deeper, and that there is something systematic underlying it. What it may be, I don't know, but I detect the very strong odor of the diabolically apocalyptic research projects agency.
Yeah,
otherwise known as DARPA.
Yeah. So there was some kind of telescope in New Mexico that was raided and shut down. That seemed to have, some longitudinal functionality to it, as well as phase conjugation. You think that may be related to to sort of?
You're talking about that telescope that was raided during the trumpet? Yes, I know which one you're talking about. I blogged about that.
Yeah.
I do not recall. Right. Again, this was not a question I was anticipating. So
sorry about that.
I'm going on foggy memory here. No, Shiloh, you go lay down. That telescope has so many strange connections.
Yeah.
Going on with it, because as I recall, there was some connection that was present at that array, a communications connection, that somehow tied that telescope into the Five Eyes network.
Oh, wow.
And there were allegations at the time that this occurred that Hillary Clinton's campaign had somehow been tapping that network through that very telescope's communications array. That was one of the
gosh.
Oh yeah, that was one of the allegations out there at the time. Folks will have to go on my website and search for the blogs that I did about this telescope. Yeah,
you have to be kidding me.
No, I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you. Then a personal friend of mine had a nephew at the time that was involved with the New Mexico State Police. That the reasons that they gave for making the raid and shutting the thing down was that there was pornography of some sort, a pornographic network of some sort that was also using that communications array, and that there was no other sinister political or technological reason behind the raid than that. Then,
the old pornography excuse.
Yeah, the old porno. Well, again, nothing would surprise me anymore, Kelly. All of the above would be the box I would tick at this juncture.
Yeah.
But then,
what a set of control files you would have then.
Well, hang on, I'm not done.
Yeah, sorry.
The telescope itself, if you look at it, is what's really interesting.
It is a very fascinating design.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a sneaky suspicion that when you look at that design, what you're really looking at is some sort of telescopic array that is actually based on phase conjugation.
Right.
That's the thing that leapt out at me at the time, that cook up whatever stories about Hillary Clinton or pornography rings or maybe the two together, cook up whatever you
But it
want.
seemed to have a grip on the Earth too.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Yeah. This thing was not any sort of typical design for a telescope, or for that matter, a radio telescope that I've ever seen.
Let's call it a transmissoscope.
Yeah, who knows what it is?
Yeah.
I honestly don't know. But I'm convinced to this day, Kelly, that raid had something to do with the actual technology that was being used there. Everything else, I think, about that whole story was cover.
Yeah, so interesting. I wonder what kind of pyramidal analogies were present in that structure.
Off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Yeah,
I'd have to go look at my blog, and at one point in my blogs, I did reproduce a diagram of the facility that I had found online, and in fact, I think it was you that sent it to me.
Yeah, maybe so. It had a strange mirror too, I think, if I remember.
It had a very strange mirror, and it was the mirror aspect of it that convinces me that this was something using phase conjugation as part of its principal phenomenon.
Right.
And the other part of it, now that my memory is jarred a little bit, is that the telescope apparently also included plasma somehow.
That's right.
As part of its operating. And again, that is a perfect mechanism for phase conjugation.
Wow.
So, I have to wonder about that whole story as to why that facility was raided and shut down.
Yeah,
it was.
This is like one of the most intense rabbit holes I think I've ever gone down.
Oh yeah,
talking about
this
stuff.
It was.
Yeah. And then but back to the plasmas, right before it's about 152 on the podcast here. Some of the questions I wanted to ask you were about, you talk about the acre, right, which is the pyramid in your new book, and you've said on some interviews about demons being able to manifest through some of these mechanisms, and that's what the ancients said anyway, and so we have this ability for demons to for spiritual energies to be able to manifest using plasmas, and the plasmas themselves may allow for the Akashic record, right? A library, the great library is maybe a plasma, right? And so how does divinity manifest through plasma, or does divinity have other aspects, other mechanisms of interaction?
Okay, I don't call God divinity. For me, God is not
I apologize for that.
No. I know what you're asking.
Yeah.
God in the Orthodox tradition is absolutely undefinable.
Right.
So in other words, I can't say that he exists nor that he doesn't exist.
Right.
This is the strange part of Orthodox theology that just does not fit into any Western thinking about it.
It sounds like a koan.
Well, that said, if by divinity you mean lesser gods or declinations,
right,
then I think it becomes possible. But let me try and set up your question without going there and talking about things that I don't want to talk about until the new book is out and people can actually see what I'm doing.
Okay.
The Demon in the Acre is the title of the new book. And the reason I talk about it, and that I decided to do a book about it, is that in this version of the Giza Death Star, the Giza Death Star Revisited, I restored an epigraph that was in the very first version of the Giza Death Star that I sent off to a publisher that rejected the book. And then when I rewrote the book and sent it off to Adventures Unlimited, who eventually did publish the book, I removed that epigraph because I thought at the time that this is already a tangled, convoluted hypothesis to begin with. The last thing we need to add to the mix is a demon.
Right.
Now, the term Acre is an Akkadian term that means quite literally mountain.
Okay.
The term itself is also used in Mesopotamia to refer to the ziggurat or to man-made pyramids. Now, the phrase, the demon in the Acre, comes from a Mesopotamian text called the Ludlul Bel Nemeki, which is a text that is cited by Zechariah Sitchin in his book, The Wars of Gods and Men.
Mm-hmm.
And he points out that in that Mesopotamian text, there is a demon in the Acre, which in Sitchin's construction of those texts refers to the Great Pyramid. Follow me?
Yeah.
So I restored Sitchin's epigraph in the Giza Death Star Revisited with the full intention of doing a webinar on my website about that specific epigraph and what it might portend for the weapon hypothesis. Now let me stop. At no point am I arguing that the presence of a demon in the structure is necessary for the weapon hypothesis to be true. What I am suggesting is that if certain contemporary speculations in physics about plasmas being a life form and possibly an intelligent life form, then what that suggests is that Sitchin's little reference in a Mesopotamian text might mean that the plasma inside the pyramid was actually a living, intelligent entity. And that is as far as I'm willing to go right now. People are going to have to wait for the new book to come out, because the other thing I'm trying to head off at the pass here is that the people who are currently suggesting that plasmas might be life forms and intelligent are referencing all sorts of Gnostic ideas.
Right.
They haven't a clue that what they're suggesting is really much more in line with traditional Christianity than with any form of Gnosticism. And to show that point, I cite a very well-known church father extensively at the very beginning of that book. And this would be a church father that would be extremely recognizable to a well-educated Roman Catholic theologian or a well-educated traditional Anglican theologian or Orthodox. In other words, it's a church father that's pre-schism.
Interesting.
And what this father has to say, I guarantee people will blow their minds when they read the specifics of it and start thinking in terms of plasma.
Wow.
It's going to rock a lot of people's world. And I hope especially those people out there, oh, rah, 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 another blow against traditional Christianity. Let's go Gnosticism. Yay, yay, yay. I got bad news for you.
So animals and plants incorporate plasma in themselves.
Yep. Yes.
And we have demon possession in animals and human beings.
Yes.
And so, therefore, if you have a piezoelectric structure that is constantly creating plasma, even when it's not operating, who's to say that it itself couldn't be possessed?
Ding, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. Now let's stop and think.
Yeah.
If you've got a plasma structure in the universe that is 137 billion light years long,
That
and
sounds like a funny number, by the way.
it is a funny number. Ding, ding, ding. But let's just say that you have such a structure. How does that structure cohere in general relativity? How does it even arise? And for that matter, how do galaxies arise?
Right.
I've never heard an explanation that makes any sense to me.
Well, if you take it from a topological point of view, the plasmas share similar properties and associate. You sort of topological entanglement could explain it.
Well, bases of attraction explain it, but that's
Right.
the point. Entanglement.
Yeah.
Entanglement. We're dealing with phenomena that the Pony Express of the velocity of light cannot explain, cannot deal with.
Yeah.
But imagine now such a structure being alive.
Yeah.
Well, that embodies perfectly the ancient view that the universe is more organism than mechanism.
Right.
Now imagine such a structure is intelligent. Well, there is your Akashic record.
Yeah.
There are your bodiless powers of the heavens. There are your bodiless powers of the heavens, tremendous knowledge and power, and so on, and so on, and so on. And by the way, if such structures are alive and intelligent, and they go to war with each other, there's your cosmic war. And it's truly cosmic.
Yeah.
Now, here's the question for everybody, and this will be my sign-off question. How does humanity contend with such a power?
Yeah, I mean,
there is a way.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be very pleasant once people understand what it is.
Humility would be one answer.
There are others.
Yeah.
There are others.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So, if you think about a plasma, let's take it for 1 second. Let's think about this intelligent plasma, this living plasma, or plasma with living aspects that may actually have non-plasma elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's treat it from an information theory point of view. If you have a plasma in space, and of course the Earth is in space, so most people, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, right? We're in heaven, whether we realize it or not. And but you think about it from an information theory point of view, plasmas are picking up harmonic vibrations from all over this 137 billion light year are picking up vibrations from all over, and that effectively creates information in the plasma.
Right. Of course.
Right.
Yeah. Plasmas are not homogeneous.
Right.
They have a lattice structure.
Right.
They're crystals.
Cellular.
So in other words, space plasmas are another way of rationalizing why many ancient systems of lore, like Judaism, view space itself as a crystal.
Interesting.
Pardon me. So what I'm suggesting here, folks, is that the plasma life hypothesis explains a lot of things.
Right.
Its explanatory power is tremendous. However, what I'm cautioning people against is a Gnostic explanation of them. And like I say, the big question is, how does humanity contend with this?
Yeah.
How does humanity contend with it? Now, the answer, when people realize what the answer is, it will rock their world,
Yeah.
because it will that answer itself will explain a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have this rejoining of science and religion.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
There are many others.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much for all your valuable time today and this fascinating.
Thank you for having me back on.
Yeah. So, can you tell people about how to reach you and how to engage with your amazing community on the web, and where they can find your books and so on?
You can find me at my website, gizadeathstar.com. That's all one word, all lowercase.
Yeah.
There's a contact button there that they can email me directly. My books you can also get on my website. The two books that we've been talking the most about today, the Giza Death Star Revisited, that one is out now. You can get it from the publisher directly, Adventures Unlimited Press or Barnes and Noble and Amazon. The only thing I'm hearing from people in Europe is that some places in Europe, Amazon is not carrying it, and some people are reporting Amazon in Europe has even banned it. So if you're trying from Europe to get the books, I would just write directly to the publisher, Adventures Unlimited Press, because I do know that they will ship books directly from the United States to people in Europe if you're willing to pay the customs and excise and shipping fees. The other book, The Demon and the Acre, is supposed to be out, I think, in August. It is available right now for pre-order from Adventures Unlimited Press. I have to warn people that that book is not as long as my other books. It's designed to be kind of a teaser, a foundation book to get people thinking about these things, but it is designed also as kind of a sequel to the Giza Death Star Revisited. So that's how you get a hold of me. We do vid chats, as you know, every 2 weeks on Friday afternoons for paying subscribe members, where people can talk to me directly, ask me questions directly. And the principal reason I do that, Kelly, is a rather obvious one. I simply don't have the time to email responses to questions anymore. So that's why I started doing vid chats years and years ago.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So you have some of your self-published books that are available on lulu.com. And you to get to those, you need to search on your name, Joseph P. Farrell. And
Right.
then you've got your other books that, because Adventures Unlimited didn't republish some of the original books.
Yeah, all of my books are on my website. So if you're
Right.
looking for my books, you can order books from my other publishers directly off my website, or if you're looking for the Lulu books, just go to Lulu and search for my name, like you say. Some of my books were published by Farrell House. They're also on my website, and you can go and order them there.
Okay.
Or just search for my name on Amazon, and you'll see my books.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. And it was been a fascinating discussion. And I really encourage people, if you think like, well, it'll be a little over my head, or you just think like maybe you understand enough from hearing the dialogue and you don't need to read the books, anything could be further from the case. There's so much more material in the books than you could ever have in an interview, that I highly encourage you to obtain them and read them, and then leave them in a coffee shop or share them with their friends. Don't hoard them in your bookcase. All right. Thank you so much, Joseph.
All right. Thank you very much for having me back, Kelly. Thank you.